War has always pushed humanity to the edge, but there are moments in history when that edge was crossed, when soldiers were no longer seen as human beings, but as material to be tested. In secret laboratories and isolated military facilities, experiments were conducted that violated every moral boundary society claimed to uphold. These were not accidents, they were not mistakes, they were decisions made deliberately, in the name of national security, scientific progress, and victory at any cost. Men were exposed to radiation without consent. Chemicals were tested on human bodies to observe how long they could endure pain. Biological agents were released in controlled environments where soldiers were told they were safe. They were not. The official records often describe these programs in cold, technical language, trials, field tests, operational research, but behind those words were real people, soldiers who trusted their governments, unaware that they had become part of an experiment they could never refuse. These experiments did not happen in the distant past of medieval cruelty. Many took place in the 20th century. Some continued long after the world claimed to understand human rights. What makes these stories truly disturbing is not just what was done, but how carefully it was hidden. Documents were classified, victims were silenced, entire programs were erased from public history. This is not a story about rogue scientists or isolated madness. It is a story about systems that decided ethics were negotiable, and human lives were expendable. This is the dark history of military experiments that crossed the line and never looked back. War does not only destroy cities and lives, it also destroys limits. When survival becomes the only objective, morality is often treated as a weakness rather than a principle. Throughout history, this mindset has repeatedly led militaries to a dangerous conclusion: if victory is essential, then anything that leads to victory can be justified. This is where ethical boundaries begin to collapse. Military experiments that crossed moral limits did not begin with madness or cruelty for its own sake. They began with fear. Fear of losing wars. Fear of falling behind enemies. Fear that hesitation could mean national extinction. Under that pressure, soldiers were slowly redefined, not as individuals with rights, but as resources. Once that shift occurred, experimentation became inevitable. Commanders and scientists asked the same question again and again: how far can the human body be pushed? How much radiation can a soldier absorb and still function? How much pain can be endured before performance collapses? How long can someone survive exposure to chemicals, extreme temperatures, or biological agents? These were not theoretical questions. They were tested. Soldiers were chosen precisely because they could not refuse. Military hierarchy removed consent from the equation. Orders replaced ethics. Silence replaced accountability. In many cases, subjects were never told they were part of an experiment at all. They were informed they were participating in training, defensive research, or routine exposure tests. The language was carefully chosen to hide the truth. What made these experiments especially disturbing was how methodical they were. Data was collected, variables were controlled, results were documented with scientific precision. Pain, injury, and death were recorded as measurements, not tragedies. In this system, human suffering became a statistic. Governments justified these actions by framing them as necessary sacrifices. Soldiers, they argued, already risked their lives in combat. Testing them under controlled conditions was portrayed as safer than exposing entire armies to unknown threats on the battlefield. This logic allowed experimentation to continue behind closed doors, shielded by secrecy and national security. But controlled does not mean ethical. Many of these experiments had nothing to do with immediate defense. They were designed to explore limits, not protect lives, to see what would happen, not to prevent harm. And once data was obtained, the subjects themselves became irrelevant. Injuries were ignored, long-term consequences were denied, records disappeared. The structure of the military made this possible. Obedience was expected, questioning orders was punished, and loyalty was weaponized. Soldiers trusted their commanders. They believed the system would protect them. That trust was exploited. What is most unsettling is how normal these decisions appeared within the system. There were no dramatic villains, no obvious turning point where morality suddenly vanished. Instead, ethics eroded gradually. justified step by step, until crossing the line felt routine. By the time the world learned fragments of these programs, the damage had already been done. And this was only the beginning. Once ethical limits were removed, the experiments became more extreme. What began as research quickly turned into systematic abuse of the human body. Soldiers were no longer treated as participants, but as instruments, used to measure how much damage a human being could endure before breaking. One of the most common areas of experimentation involved chemical exposure. Military scientists wanted to know how the human body would react to toxic substances on the battlefield. Instead of relying on simulations, they exposed real people. Soldiers were placed in sealed chambers filled with gas. Others were ordered to apply chemicals directly to their skin. Some were injected. Many were never informed what they were being exposed to. The effects were immediate and brutal. Burning lungs, blistering skin, loss of vision, convulsions, long-term organ damage. In official reports, these reactions were described in neutral language, responses, side effects, biological reactions. The human suffering behind those words was deliberately erased. Radiation experiments followed a similar pattern. As nuclear weapons became central to military strategy, governments needed data on how radiation affected the human body. Instead of protecting soldiers, they exposed them. Troops were positioned near nuclear test sites. Others were injected with radioactive materials without their knowledge. The goal was not treatment or safety, it was observation. Many of these soldiers lived long enough to suffer the consequences. Cancers, genetic damage, chronic illness, psychological trauma. When victims later sought answers, they were met with silence or denial. Medical records were classified. Connections were dismissed as coincidence. Responsibility was avoided. Biological experiments crossed an even darker line. Pathogens were tested to observe infection rates, symptoms, and mortality. In some cases, entire units were exposed to bacteria or viruses under the guise of defensive preparedness. Soldiers were told they were being vaccinated or trained. In reality, they were being infected. Survival was never guaranteed. Extreme environment experiments pushed the human body past natural limits. Subjects were frozen, overheated, deprived of oxygen, or starved to observe how long they could remain functional. Pain thresholds were measured, endurance was quantified, collapse was documented. What makes these experiments horrifying is not just their cruelty, but their precision. Every scream, every failure, every death was logged as data. Human beings were reduced to variables in a calculation designed to improve efficiency. Lethality, or control. Consent did not exist. In many cases, the victims were young soldiers who believed they were serving their country. They trusted the system, they followed orders, and that obedience became the tool that allowed the experiments to continue. By the time fragments of these programs surfaced, governments claimed ignorance or necessity. They argued that the Cold War, global threats, and unknown enemies justified extraordinary measures. But necessity does not erase responsibility. These experiments revealed a chilling truth. Once ethics are treated as optional, there is no natural stopping point. The question is no longer should we do this, but how far can we go? And history shows that when the answer is measured only in results, the cost is always paid in human lives. When the experiments ended, the damage did not. What followed was a second violation, quieter, colder, and often more permanent. It was not carried out in laboratories, but in offices, courtrooms, and archives. This phase was not about testing bodies. It was about erasing responsibility. Governments understood the danger of exposure. If the truth became public, it would not only reveal cruelty, it would undermine trust in the very institutions meant to protect their citizens. So secrecy became policy, and denial became strategy. Documents were classified for decades. Some were destroyed outright, others were fragmented, scattered across agencies so that no single record told the full story. Medical files were altered. Experimental reports were rewritten using technical language designed to obscure rather than explain. What could not be erased was buried beneath bureaucracy. Victims were left alone. Many soldiers who participated in these experiments did not immediately understand what had been done to them. Symptoms appeared years later: unexplained illnesses, psychological breakdowns, Genetic damage passed to their children. When they sought answers, they were told there was no connection, no proof, no record. Some were accused of imagining their suffering. Others were threatened into silence. Non-disclosure agreements were enforced under national security laws. Speaking out meant risking legal consequences, loss of benefits, or being labeled unpatriotic. In extreme cases, whistleblowers were discredited, isolated, or destroyed professionally. The system protected itself. Public admissions, when they came at all, were carefully controlled. Governments acknowledged mistakes without admitting intent. Apologies were issued without accountability. Compensation programs were limited, slow, and buried in paperwork designed to exhaust survivors rather than help them. And even then, the full truth was never released. What makes this phase especially disturbing is how normalized it became. The erasure of evidence was treated as administrative necessity. Silencing victims was framed as protecting national security. Justice was postponed indefinitely until witnesses died. Memories faded, and outrage disappeared. History was rewritten not with lies, but with omission. This deliberate forgetting created a dangerous precedent. By avoiding accountability, institutions learned they could cross ethical boundaries without consequence, as long as the aftermath was managed correctly. The lesson was not never do this again. It was never let it be seen. Meanwhile, the victims lived with the consequences. They carried physical scars no one acknowledged, psychological wounds no one documented. They were denied recognition not only as victims, but as participants in history. Their suffering existed in a space without language, without validation, without closure. This silence did not protect society. It weakened it. Because when crimes are hidden rather than confronted, they do not disappear. They become templates. They teach future generations that ethics are flexible, that accountability is optional, and that power can rewrite morality if given enough secrecy. The experiments ended. The mindset did not. And as long as these stories remain partially buried, the conditions that allowed them to happen remain intact, waiting for the next crisis. The next war, the next justification. The most dangerous consequence of unethical military experiments is not what happened in the past. It is what they taught the future. When institutions cross moral boundaries without facing real consequences, those boundaries do not disappear, they weaken. Each hidden experiment, each silenced victim, each erased document becomes a precedent, a quiet message passed down through systems of power. This can be done again. And it has. Modern warfare no longer relies solely on human bodies, but the mindset behind past experiments remains disturbingly familiar. Today, instead of testing chemicals on soldiers, militaries test algorithms on populations. Instead of exposing bodies to radiation, they expose societies to surveillance, psychological pressure, and behavioral manipulation. The subjects have changed, the logic has not. Technology has become the new testing ground. Autonomous weapons systems are deployed with limited transparency. Artificial intelligence is trained to identify threats, decide targets, and act faster than human oversight allows. Psychological operations are refined using real-world data harvested from civilians. These systems are introduced gradually, framed as defensive, efficient, and necessary. Once again, consent is absent. The lessons of the past were never fully absorbed because the past was never fully confronted. Without accountability, there was no reckoning. Without reckoning, there was no reform. Ethics became conditional, something to be applied only when convenient. This is the true legacy of unethical military experimentation. It is not only the physical damage done to individuals decades ago. It is the normalization of the idea that extreme measures are acceptable in extreme circumstances. That national security can override human rights. That secrecy justifies everything. Crises make this logic irresistible. When new threats emerge, terrorism, cyber warfare, biological risk, the same arguments return. We don't have time for debate. We can't afford hesitation. This is for everyone's safety. Each generation believes it is facing a unique danger. Each generation is tempted to repeat the same mistakes. What makes the present moment especially dangerous is scale. Past experiments harmed hundreds or thousands. Modern systems can affect millions instantly. Decisions once made in laboratories are now embedded in code. operating invisibly and continuously. And when harm occurs, responsibility becomes even harder to trace. Who is accountable when an algorithm discriminates? When an autonomous system makes a lethal mistake? When psychological manipulation destabilizes entire societies? The absence of clear answers mirrors the past, where victims were left searching for someone to blame, only to find silence. The ethical line was crossed once. It becomes easier to cross again. History does not repeat itself because it wants to. It repeats because its warnings are ignored. Unethical military experiments were not just historical crimes. They were rehearsals for a future where power seeks efficiency without empathy, control without consent, and progress without accountability. And unless the past is fully acknowledged, the next experiment may not look like a laboratory at all. It may look like the world itself. History often comforts us with the idea that humanity learns from its mistakes. That once a line is crossed and recognized as wrong, it will never be crossed again. But the history of unethical military experiments tells a far darker story. The problem was never a lack of knowledge. It was a lack of restraint. What these experiments revealed is not just how far science can go, but how easily morality can be suspended when fear, power, and secrecy combine. Soldiers were exposed, poisoned, irradiated, infected, and broken, not because their suffering was misunderstood, but because it was calculated. Their pain was weighed against strategic advantage and found acceptable. That is the truth history struggles to face. Governments did not simply fail to protect their soldiers. They made a choice to redefine human beings as tools, a choice to treat ethics as an obstacle rather than a boundary. And once that choice was made, everything that followed became disturbingly logical. The experiments ended. The consequences did not. Victims carried the damage for the rest of their lives, often without recognition, justice, or apology. Families inherited illness and trauma without ever knowing the cause. Records were erased, responsibility dissolved, and time was allowed to do what accountability never did: make the problem disappear. But disappearance is not resolution. The most dangerous legacy of these experiments is not what they did to the past, but what they normalized for the future. They proved that under the right conditions, systems of power will always be tempted to trade humanity for control. That extreme circumstances will always be used to justify extreme actions, and that secrecy remains the most effective weapon against public conscience. Today, the experiments look different. They no longer always involve physical suffering in laboratories. They are embedded in systems, algorithms, surveillance networks, and psychological operations. The language has changed, the logic has not. Once again, consent is blurred. Once again, accountability is delayed. Once again, harm is framed as necessary. The lesson history offers is brutally simple. Ethical boundaries do not protect themselves. They exist only as long as societies are willing to defend them, even when doing so feels inconvenient, risky, or slow. Unethical military experiments were not the result of a few bad individuals. They were the product of institutions that believed victory mattered more than dignity, and secrecy mattered more than truth. That belief has not vanished. It waits for fear. It waits for crisis. It waits for silence. If these stories remain buried, they will not serve as warnings. They will serve as instructions. Because the moment humanity becomes optional, anything becomes possible. And history has already shown us exactly how far that road goes.